Welcome to the Actual Fluency Podcast. Each week you'll find inspirational and motivational interviews with some of the world's best language learners, industry experts, all trying to help you to learn foreign languages better, faster, and more efficiently. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by the italki Goals Competition, where you can win up to $500 of italki credits and $500 towards a flight ticket of your choice. All you have to do is take a picture or record a video of you saying your language goals for 2019 and sharing them with italki on social media. For full details on how to enter the competition, go to actualfluency.com/goals. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 142 of the Actual Fluency Podcast. My name is Chris Broholm, as per usual. If you're listening to this for the first time, welcome. Today we're talking about Pidgins and Creoles, a topic that is very interesting. And the reason that we're doing that is because today's guest, Amarinder from America, wrote to me and said, "Hey Chris, do you want to feature this topic on the podcast? I could do some research and present the topic and you could ask some questions." And I was like, yeah, perfect. I think I did about half a semester of linguistics when I was doing an English degree at university. I never finished that degree, so it's not that impressive. But I did enjoy that part of the linguistics. And I know a lot of you guys out there are also interested in this topic, which is closely related to minority languages, endangered languages, and now today we're going to talk about this group of languages, sometimes referred to as contact languages. But Amarinder is really the self-taught expert here. I don't really know that much about it. But what I wanted to say before we dive into today's topic, which is a little bit more linguistics than normal, is if you have a topic that you'd like to present on the podcast, maybe you're an expert in a certain strange dialect, or maybe a way of learning languages, a technical system or research. If you want to come on the podcast and present your findings, I'd be happy to be the ignorant question asker and try to explore the topic with you, just for the benefit of everyone. Because I think that learning languages, the people who learn languages and listen to this, most people are probably interested in, how can I learn French or German, or more of the common languages better. But I think a lot of people listening also have a keen interest in pretty much all things languages. I mean, I know I do. So if that's the case, you really enjoy this episode. And if you have any ideas or topics that you'd like to present, do get in touch. Actualfluency.com. There's a contact link in the top bar. So with that said, let's get into the episode. Well, Amarinder, welcome to the show. It's been a while coming, but finally we found some common time to sit down and talk about this topic. So why don't you take it away and let everyone know who you are, where you're from, and how you got interested in the topic of Pidgin Creole contact languages.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Big fan of the show. My name is Amarinder Grewal. I live here in the United States. I was born and raised in the United States. For those who may not be familiar with the country too much, it is truly a multilingual country, and I grew up in a multilingual family. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which has always welcomed immigrants when they've come to this country, particularly because it has a large manufacturing base. So, just in my lifetime alone, I've seen many different ethnic groups make their first, take their first steps into the country through Detroit. I grew up with many people who came from Southeast Asia, from Laos, from Vietnam. After some of the troubles that happened in the Balkans, a lot of folks, Bosnians, things of that nature, and unfortunately they had some issues in their homelands, so they immigrated into the Detroit area, and that was a great experience for me. And there's also a large Middle Eastern population as well, because I heard these languages all day, every day. I mean, walking the halls at school, I was hearing different languages spoken all over the place. Obviously, we had the common language of English. So languages have surrounded me in that sense, growing up in such a diverse town. And my parents themselves emigrated from India, an area of northwest India known as Punjab. So in my house growing up, Punjabi was the main language, which I'm fluent in. I don't even think I learned how to speak English, to be quite honest with you, until I was probably like six. Even though I lived in the United States, and we were living in an Indian community in Detroit. So when I got in the school system is when I really started more contact with English on a daily basis. I also have a pretty good understanding of Hindi. You know, Hindi is heavily used by many populations in the Indian subcontinent. And there's also Urdu. Urdu is very similar to Hindi, so I kind of got that language on a discount, as it were, uh, because of their similarities. I picked up on it pretty quick. Very fortunate. And then lastly, as an adult, I've learned French at a pretty high level. I've been spending about 2.5, 3 years dedicated to learning it, and this may be the last year I study it so intensely. Maybe time to move on to other languages, but that's kind of my language background and kind of where I come from in the States. And I have had a fascination with history since I was a child, and particularly history in the last 400 or 500 years. And because of that, you read a lot of things about colonialism and some other topics that, from time to time, Creole languages, Pidgin languages would be mentioned in this greater topic. And, I kind of nerded out and spent a little bit more time understanding what these Creole languages, what these Pidgin languages were, just out of personal interest. And that's what kind of drew me there.
Cool. And I can't wait to hear more about it because I think I had about half an hour of it in I did a couple of semesters of a degree in linguistics, so there was like a half hour topic on it. So I don't really know anything, mainly because I was quite distant at that time. But just before we get into that, just wanted to just round up your story there with the French. You said that's quite a recent thing in the last few years. Was there anything
Yeah.
that prompted you to do that? Was it a trip or an experience or?
So, yeah, Detroit is a border town in essence. I mean, we're right on the border with Canada, just a bridge or a tunnel away. I took many trips into French Canada, which is, if anybody hasn't been to Montreal or Quebec and you have the opportunity, definitely give it a shot. Canada in general, but those towns are just amazing places to visit. So I wanted to, when I was younger, learn a little bit. So it kind of piqued my interest. You have to choose languages in high school. Unfortunately, the instruction wasn't the best, but I chose French. So I got a little bit of a introduction there, and travels later. I just thought, hey, I like the literature. I like traveling to many countries which happen to have large French-speaking populations, and not just France. I've traveled to a dozen plus countries. I have lived in the Middle East. I have worked all around the States, traveled all around Europe, been to Africa, and where French is heavily spoken as well. So the travels and language learning kind of go hand in hand. Obviously, you want to be respectful to the host country that you're in, and at least give it a shot, and give it a go, and speak the language that's spoken there by the people. So
Yeah, very cool. I was in Montreal in 2016 for the first time.
nice,
Absolutely wonderful town, and
amazing.
I would live there if I could.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
a great place, and it's got that mix of cultures as well. Like you see all kinds of cuisines and different neighborhoods, and they all have different great things to offer. And
Yeah.
most of all, I think they all just share that Canadian hospitality. I really felt very welcomed when I came there.
Yeah, and
And
I felt the same way. I felt the same way.
yeah, and of course we've got the bonus now that if you're into languages, you can go to Langfest in August.
Yep.
If anyone's listening and have the opportunity to go, I highly recommend that. It's a good excuse to explore a city you maybe haven't been to, and hang out with a bunch of language learning people. If they're all
Yeah.
extremely nice people, and there's some interesting talks going on, some good walks and group events. So if anyone's interested in that, it's langfest.org, I think is the website, and they have some early bird pricing as well. So I highly recommend that, and I hope I can go back this year. Of course, having to travel the
Yeah.
Atlantic is a little bit inconvenient at times, but if I can, I
Yeah.
definitely
Well,
will.
from where I live in the Midwest, I think I actually did go in 2016, or not 20, no, 2017 myself, and the drive was about somewhere about 12 to 14 hours. So it's not too bad, and I can still get there. So I hope to make it there myself. Amazing town, and obviously interesting venue as well.
Yeah, that would be great if you could both make it there and meet up in person. You
Yeah,
should
absolutely.
submit a talk request to talk about
Maybe.
Pidgin Creole languages. That's what they would really love that, I think, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, so for the people listening, maybe we should just start all the way at the basics. So what are, I'm sure they've heard the word Creole maybe, or the word pigeon even. Or, yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, not the bird, but the language. But so what does it actually mean, and how did you first come across it?
Yeah, so the American Linguistic Society, I was kind of doing some research. They kind of pointed me to Ethnologue, and I'll give you some links so you can put this in your show notes. But there's roughly 7,000 languages, 7,000, 7,100 that are spoken on Earth. And these languages that I guess we'll be talking about today make up a very small portion of that, from what I can tell. I can't find hard and fast numbers, but it appears to be a very small subsection of that larger 7,000. Um, as I mentioned before, big history buff, and when you read about history and you read about military history in particular, something that I've read extensively on since I was a child. I also served in the military, so definitely an interesting topic for me. And invariably, what you get to see is that what many of these colonial powers during the quote unquote scramble for Africa and scramble for some of these other areas, trying to get colonies there, these European nations, pretty much starting from the age of exploration on, so 15th, 16th century on, traveled around the world, made contact with many populations they really had no direct contact with before. And that contact obviously necessitates a need to be able to communicate with each other. And that is kind of where these languages come from. Sometimes it's some of these cultures, like the Portuguese and Dutch, I believe, it's more commercial and trading in nature with their, for example, with Japan, with the Empire of Japan, they had a pretty solid, I believe, trading network there. And sometimes, unfortunately, it was more so, yeah, conquered people. For example, the British conquered most of South Asia, which today would be Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal,
Hmm.
that area. So again, with the whole military history thing in mind, these colonial powers tended to also raise local levies. They would have soldiers from these colonies because, case in point, England. England is a very small country. The population is not large, but their empire spanned the world. I mean, there's a saying I read once that the sun never set on the British
Yeah,
Empire.
right.
Yeah. So unfortunately, with very few men at their disposal in their military, they would raise these local troops, as did the French and the Dutch, and there would be a need to communicate military orders to them. And I was particularly interested in some of these units, such as the African tirailleurs and things of that nature. So that's kind of where my first interest in this got piqued. But Pidgins and Creoles in general are categorized as contact languages, and contact meaning contact between two or more different groups of people, and in most cases with vastly different languages. And it's good to point here that if you read the literature, if you read journal articles, textbooks, I've seen the term mixed language
Okay.
come into the picture as well. So a mixed language is kind of a larger category, which has Pidgins and Creoles in there, but it's not only Pidgins and Creoles. For example, there's a language in Canada called Michif. Um, I was reading some information at the University of North Dakota. Michif is a language in Canada that's spoken by a community that has roots in the Cree and the Ojibwe people in that area, and their language, the Michif language, has a heavy dose of French, I believe, in there as well. it's a mixed language. It's not a Creole language. It's not a Pidgin. So these contact languages, a subset of mixed languages, they kind of develop there's a development cycle, I guess, to them. So I'll just give an example. Population A pretty much comes in and conquers population B. Unfortunately, that is the case in many of these languages. There's a need to speak between this first generation of peoples. Invariably, the group that is on the losing end of that, it has to kind of learn the language of the folks that have come into the area, and that's the beginning of a pidgin. A pidgin is I like to call it language light, in the sense that it's a very pared down grammatical structure. It's a very pared down vocabulary, and it seems to be very transactionally based. I need to buy this from you. I need you to go over there. Like those very simple types of, I guess, constructs in language. And some of them are very well, when they develop more and, then they get into the Creole side of it. So that's kind of what a pidgin language is. And those languages are probably the ones I'm more fascinated of in these two. So a pidgin language, when it acquires native speakers, is essentially a Creole at that point, because now you have folks, by this time more than likely the language has gotten more complex. The two or more populations have been living together for much longer, or they have more contact, however you want to phrase it. So these languages have and I would highly suggest, if anybody's interested in this, to read a set of books from Oxford known as the Survey of Pidgin and Creole Languages. It's been invaluable to me, and there's also a website that they maintain, but that kind of gives you a little bit more on the linguistics of this. But these languages are classified by what's known as their lexifer. That's kind of the language they're based on. So Haitian Creole, which is probably the most successful Creole language in the world. I mean, like 10 million plus speakers from what I was reading. So the lexifer for that, the base of that, is French. Mm-hmm. And in interspersed with that are, unfortunately, the French were using Haiti as a slave colony. So they enslaved Africans and brought them a very treacherous journey to work. I believe there's sugar plantations in Haiti, and they brought their languages with them. And that, working with that French lexifer, that French base, started more than likely off as a pidgin and then became a Creole. And it's talking more about the lifespan of the language. So if you think about it, a pidgin may never become a Creole. Okay, that is not necessarily always the case. A Creole may not necessarily have come from a pidgin. But usually what happens is a pidgin will become a Creole, and then there's this other fascinating concept that I've been reading about, even though I haven't found a specific example. It's called decreolization. And what happens to the Creole is, in essence, the Creole language, these folks still have some sort of a contact with the lexifer, the base language, and the Creole kind of starts to become more and more like the standard version of the language, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, again, that doesn't always happen. I've read it referred to as the post-Creole continuum. So it's a lot of interesting labels in this world of this specific corner of linguistics. But that's kind of the basics. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. One thing I was wondering a little bit that I had never heard about is how long does it actually take? Are there any ideas of, let's say, two languages or two groups of people meet to form or to start this pidgin process where they need to communicate, but none of them understand anything? I'm just wondering.
That's a fascinating part to me too.
Yeah, I'm like, what? Imagine yourself doing that, going to, I don't know, China or going to some country where you have no idea about the language, not one word, and then just speaking your language to that person. That would, I just don't even see how that would happen. It must take, it must take months and years.
Yeah, I was talking to my wife about the same thing. I'm like, I've always been interested in how they develop, because I guess if me and you, if you only spoke, let's say you only spoke German to me, and I in turn only spoke Spanish to you. Obviously, there's probably some similarities, but we'd probably start off by saying picking up an object and saying this is a book in
Right.
my language, and I would imagine it start from there. But and when you add in some of these other historical dynamics and the transactional based nature of some of these relationships, it would have been fascinating how they would have developed. And another thing to point out here is that these are very different from auxiliary languages and constructed languages in that I don't know too much about those languages, but from what I've read, there's a large amount of design that goes on there for, the constructed nature of it. And then over time, I've heard there's been large gatherings of folks who are interested in these language who kind of tweak the language even more.
Yeah, that
Whereas
happens. Yeah.
these languages kind of just work in the natural environment, and they grow from there. And it's a fascinating process. But yeah, that is something that's piqued my interest a lot, and I want to learn more about that for sure.
Did you do like an experiment to see? But I guess things are easy because you can point at something and keep saying the same word, and eventually people will know, okay, that's the thing you're talking about. But I'm thinking like verbs must be tricky,
Yeah.
or like any esoteric feeling. Like you can't. There's no metaphors or anything in a pigeon, I imagine. Because
Yeah,
how could you ever
I think
explain
I agree with
that?
you. Yeah, I would agree with you. Maybe definitely probably in Creole, but in a pidgin, I would agree with you 100%. And what you've been saying kind of brings something to my mind. I've read many a journal article and book on this where the author is implying that explicitly or not that the study of these languages is important because it gives us a look at the development of language and humanity in general.
Hmm.
So it's I think linguistics departments probably across the world look at these languages, see these languages to try to figure out how languages develop in general. So definitely an important piece in that regard. But I agree. Some of those larger concepts, more philosophical things, definitely have to. There would
Feelings.
have to be a lot of friction. There'd have to be a lot of friction.
Yeah, trial and error and lots of time. I guess the languages that we have, I mean, even the established languages are changing all the time. Like,
Hmm.
if you compare English 100 years ago to English today, it's night and day. Many of the European languages are losing their formal aspects, like Danish, for instance. German,
Really.
a little bit less so, but like it's happening where you used to have this very formal code of speaking similar to Japanese or like in Russian, I think it's pretty established still that if you don't know the person, you speak in a very formal way. You have the formal variants, but like in my lifetime, the Danish one is almost gone, just like that, and that's only been 30 years or so. It was on the way out when I was growing up. I was one of the, I guess I was employed in like a nice supermarket where they insisted on if it was an older person, you'd call them by the polite one. But today you can say anything. You just say, "Hey, you," you know.
Yeah.
So the language is always developing, which is interesting. But I guess it's a different. It's different and it's the same. I guess I don't know how to look at
Yeah. I
that.
mean, and languages, I mean, my personal view on languages and the development of language, I agree with you 100%. Obviously, technology has just changed everything
Yeah,
in the last few decades, and not just for folks like us who are interested in learning languages and can use all these neat tools, but just the way folks communicate in general. And what's, I mean, I'm sure you've come across this. English is king in the world. I mean,
hmm,
English is being learned
definitely.
heavily. English is in every corner of the world. I've traveled everywhere, and that's been a good thing. If I couldn't speak to them in one language, almost always I could find somebody who speaks English. I mean, I even read a stat recently that said most English speakers in the world live in India
Right.
because of the size of the population. So
Yeah.
um, I think there's going to be probably a shift in the next 50 years to where English becomes more and more dominant than it already is. And some of these other languages are they gonna are they going to shift and become more English-like, or they're just going to? I mean, I've been to Europe, and I'll never forget the day I was in Germany, my wife and I, and there's a young lady. I needed directions, and I'm trying with the best as I can in German to speak to her, and she's like, do you speak English? I'm like, yes, I do. She says, I speak very bad English. And then she goes off to rattle directions in perfect English. I was like, yes, your English is actually very, very good.
Yeah.
And we had a little chat. So, um, yeah, I think English is just taking everything over. Right? And I think some of the interesting things I've seen come out of France, from the Académie Française, trying to, have French have a little bit stronger presence in the world. I think those are interesting initiatives. Not 100% sure how successful they'll be.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I'm
but yeah, I
thinking
think
about
that
it in Danish as well, just as a good example. Maybe it's because it's a small language, so it's quite
mm,
uh, pliable or moldable. You know, you can kind of shift it a little bit because English words are just creeping in all over the place.
really.
Yeah, so if you say something to a friend, obviously this is what younger people say because the older generation have almost a different vernacular. But the younger people, they could, if you say something good, like you have a good experience or something, the answer might just be nice, like the word nice,
Hmm.
or and in many cases, it kind of it explores or shows some weaknesses in the original language, I would say, because people, if they know both words, the Danish and the English one, and they still choose the English one, it must be because the English one more correctly translate that feeling they're having at that moment, which
More
is what,
efficient. Yeah.
yeah, which is what languages are doing. You know, we're not translating from our head
True.
word for word. We're basically translating emotion or feeling or whatever our brains
Mm.
up to. So it is an interesting discussion. I would love to hear from people how it's working for their language, like their native language. Is the English creeping in there as well? Because I know in Danish it definitely is a lot, and everyone speaks English there as well. So I don't know if
Mm.
I don't think it's ever gonna like take over or anything, but it might definitely change the language so much that they have to rewrite some of the grammar rules and maybe send out some official guidelines, which happens occasionally. I think
Really.
Danish had some rules changed in the last 100 years for sure. Like they had some spelling rules changed. I know Russian as well has gone through, I believe, two grammar revisions in the last 100 years. So languages are always changing. It's just about what direction, I guess, if it's a desirable way. But I think it's a pretty natural process. So I'm
Yeah.
positive in that the language we get is an improvement of the old one. Of course, I wouldn't
Mm.
want to like lose languages if it could be avoided, but
No, definitely not. Yeah.
that would be a different story.
Yeah, and that's one of the dangers. I mean, living here in the United States, beside Pidgins and Creoles, I'm also very interested in Native American languages. And when you kind of lose a language, you lose a portion of those people's history in some ways. The way they obviously, like you said, related emotion to each other, and things of that nature. And we've lost many languages already. So it does behoove us to put a little bit more effort in learning some of these. And I know you and others have spoken on that topic before, for sure.
Yeah, and that's also the hope of sharing this topic with people is that hopefully there'll be people who see this as an interesting either pastime like yourself or maybe
Yeah.
even a full time in linguistics kind of capacity, which is also
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean these linguists go to great lengths. I've read about linguists who go to very different places in the world, with a microphone in hand, kind of cataloging these languages as best as they can. So a very interesting field in general.
Yeah, and is there any? I actually saw that Duolingo was coming out with Haitian Creole, or they put it in the
Oh,
incubator. So I guess that's one way to increase the awareness.
yeah.
And I just want to take a brief moment to just talk about some things that are happening over at italki, which is the show's main sponsor. Italki is a tutoring platform where you can get lessons in pretty much every language, and usually you can find lessons very cheap, so it doesn't break the bank. It doesn't cost as much as evening classes, and you can do it over Skype, from your home in your underwear, whatever you prefer to do, and it's just a super convenient way to learn. And I think one-on-one tutoring is one of the most efficient ways to learn anyway because the materials are so tailored to you. Your level is the only one the teacher needs to take care of. So you can definitely learn a lot in a very little time compared to traditional methods. Right now, there's two things going on in Italki you need to know. So there's the goals competition, which I mentioned in the intro. So if you go to actualfluency.com/goals, you can see the competition there. Basically, you just have to share a photo or video with a hashtag, and you could win $500 worth of credits towards lessons, including a $500 flight ticket, or towards a flight ticket if you want to go far, where you can choose where to go, basically. So that's the grand prize. The other thing is the language challenge is returning on italki, so that starts February 1st. And basically, you commit to taking a number of lessons, and then you can win prizes by completing those number of lessons. I highly recommend this because you can choose how many you want to go for, and having this kind of extra reason to do a lot of lessons can really boost your learning. Just be sure not to go overboard. It's easy to burn out after doing a lot of lessons in a short period of time. So yeah, check that out. You can find the challenge at actualfluency.com/challenge and see all the rules and prizes there. So hope you enjoy those initiatives from italki. And if you want to get started with a lesson, you get $10 free credit after doing your first lesson. So that's for everyone. You don't need a special link for that. If you use actualfluency.com/italki, they will be very happy and they can see that it's worth for them to be part of this show. So anyway, let's get back to the show with Kirsten Cable talking about goals and New Year's resolutions.
Haitian Creole is an interesting one because it's a successful language, first and foremost. And I say that because millions of people speak that language. Here in the United States, there's many Haitian Americans who live all around the country, but I've been fortunate to meet many in Florida. And I've also went to school with some Haitian Americans, and so the language has a little bit more of I guess, a footprint outside of Haiti than some people may think. It also Haitian Creole is also interesting because I've also been reading a lot about the fact that, at least as of a few years ago, the language of instruction in Haiti is French,
right?
Standard French, but everybody speaks Haitian Creole. Very few people, it appears, are fluent in French, and I've come across that myself. I've met younger folks who are fluent in French, and some older Haitian Americans who were not fluent in French, but obviously were in Haitian Creole.
Mm-hmm.
And that language is interesting because, as I mentioned, obviously you have the lexifer, the base language of French, which is a language I've been learning, and then you have all these interesting African languages and their words, and Spanish, I believe, is also involved. I was reading, and this is where language, the learnability of the language, kind of comes into play, because one of the things I came across was there's like 15 different types of dictionaries for Haitian Creole.
Okay.
Was one stat that I heard. That type of foundation, that type of, I guess, that is what helps some of these languages, I think, stay strong and keep moving on. And Haiti, obviously, as we know, Haiti's an interesting example in history, as we were talking about. It was a slave colony, unfortunately, but they were able to beat back the French and gain their independence. And there was a monarchy, I believe, at one point. There was a dictatorship, unfortunately, for many, a brutal one at that, for many decades. And then obviously they've had some unfortunate natural disaster hit them, like that large earthquake, and also some hurricanes as well. But they're just resilient people, and they just keep moving on. And they definitely, Haitian Creole is a big part of who they are. So, they have the size, millions of people, and they have the drive to to keep it going and to keep it strong. So
yeah. And when does it become like when is it like an established language? Is it already
yeah, I mean
maybe?
it is, and the Creole designation refers more to almost in a sense to its historical context as being a language that it didn't develop by itself with one people living on this island. It was, and you could probably say most languages in the beginning were probably Creoles. Was one author made it seem like, where multiple populations came together, whatever the situation may be, and it came out. It is definitely an established language,
Right.
and Creole language or designation is more a linguistic exercise as far as I can tell. And there's like I said, the pigeons are the ones that to me are the most interesting,
Yeah.
um, because they they're small, as I mentioned, language light. They don't have a lot of information on them. There's been some folks, like I said, those linguists with the microphone going everywhere in the world to kind of catalog these items, but there's been many pigeons that just aren't spoken anymore because there's no need for them. Um, in the sense that those populations don't have different ways of communicating now.
Yeah.
The two that come to mind, and two that I'm particularly interested in, coming again, the first one I read about in that Oxford guide that I was telling you is Chinese Pigeon Russian.
That's a bit of a
So
mix, isn't it?
it is very much. That's what popped out of me at the page. I'm like, what is this? A Chinese Pigeon Russian? Obviously, the countries are right next to each other,
Yeah,
so it
it makes
makes sense
sense.
that they've, yeah, and um, obviously Siberia with northern China and Mongolia, Manchuria, and those areas. So this language was spoken, by the way, as best as I can tell, for like 100 plus years. Um, there's no known speakers of it today, I believe. The lexifer, the base language for this pigeon, was Russian,
Right.
and it was kind of used in and around that border between those two countries, or where they are relatively closer together. And it was mostly used, it appears, for commercial basis, trading, things of that nature. And I believe there's been some conflicts between in that area in the past. I'm not too read up on it, but it's an interesting one just because it's Chinese Pigeon Russian obviously jumps off the page, but it never creolized. So these two groups, it didn't appear to be a large intermarriage going on. There wasn't, as far as I can tell, a large amount of children who were produced, who were of Chinese and Russian descent. So there were no native speakers.
Right.
So it was used for a long time, used on a commercial basis, and never creolized.
But we have
And most
records
of
of
the
it, or how do we
we
know
have
about it?
records of it. Yeah, so we have records of it stretching back. I think if you look on the Apex website, going back, I think to the 19th century, and it was mostly from the look of it, Russian linguists who were in the area, kind of just looking at it, cataloging it, and things of that nature. Unfortunately, many of these journal articles were written in Russian, a language I do not currently speak or know how to read and write. So it may be maybe where I go next, just so I can read some of these articles, or have them translated somehow. But yeah, that's how we know them. I mean, there's been some other interesting work that linguists do in this regard. For example, I came across some information that during World War One, the German military had taken a large amount of POWs, prisoners of war, and obviously they were fighting the French and the British primarily. And the French and the British had a large amount of troops that came from outside of France and England to fight on the Western Front. So these German linguists were like, "Hey, this is this is quite a situation. We had the languages of the world in these POW camps." So they went to these POW camps and just started recording these POWs and
Oh.
cataloging the languages and learning more about them. So yeah, there's been some interesting methods that they've used, even in some unfortunate times like that, to kind of get these data and catalog it for the greater good, for posterity's sake.
Yeah, and I suppose it's unlikely that a pigeon, well, maybe not, but I suppose it's quite unlikely that we'll see many more new ones come out because almost everyone now can just go to Google Translate, and just speak into the
Yeah,
phone and get a
so
translation set out. And it's such a global community now that, it seems unlikely that a situation would occur where two populations would meet organically in some kind of situation.
yeah, I've thought about that myself, and I've looked at it. I haven't found too many like modern day pigeons per se, or definitely not Creoles. There is one thing that I came across. A large amount of people from South Asia they work in the Middle East, and I've seen references to a potential pigeon that has formed there between the South Asian workers and the native population. I think mostly the Gulf states that
Hmm.
employ them. Uh, so that's the only real one that I've seen that could be modern. And most of these definitely did seem to, originate in the past, sometimes a very, very long time ago, and continue on to the future. So in some cases.
Before the Google Translates and everything made it.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. If I wanted to today, I could go to the airport and probably be in England in less than 8 hours. That's not something that was always around.
Yeah.
So that travel technology, all that has sped a lot of stuff up, and we see it in languages. And the most fascinating pidgin language to me, it comes again out of that history, the love of history. There's a group of famous soldiers that fought in the French military that were known as the tirailleurs, they were tirailleurs Senegalese. They were West African infantrymen who fought in the French army. I mean, I think pretty much most of the 19th century and half of the 20th century. They fought in both world wars. And while I was studying these men who were very good infantrymen, um, I came across a master's thesis from Hedvig Skirgaard in Stockholm University, and he was talking about their language, the language that they used with their French officers. It was called Français tirailleur. The lexicon was French.
Hmm.
It was a pidgin, and it was mixed with African languages such as Wolof, Fulani, and it's an interesting example of a language just like that Chinese Pidgin Russian, which lasted for a significant amount of time, was transactionally based, meaning military orders. I need you to do this. You need to go here. You need to do that. And then, after the French pretty much left the continent, I think all French colonies, from what I read in the article, the French had left the continent by the 60s. And it has some interesting add-on. The first president, I believe, of Senegal was himself a tirailleur, and he actually was a prisoner of war in World War II. So, um, it's a fascinating topic, obviously, with a very unique military unit. But then this idea of this pidgin language that they were using to work with each other kind of just leapt off the page, and it's very interesting that this Swedish linguist first thesis went into quite in depth into the topic. This was very nice to see. So
Yeah, I guess every history nerd out there is really listening along with this and going like, yeah, oh, that's an interesting topic. Let's go for that.
yeah,
I find it very interesting as well. One thing I was thinking about is well, if these pigeons are mostly sort of well, either they're creolized or they're gone, like
yeah,
the speakers have disappeared.
yeah,
It's not an there's no, I suppose there are no real ways for someone who might be fascinated about this to actually learn something. Are
yeah.
there any languages that are, I guess it's a very sweet spot between somewhat, alive, but also not totally formed as a language, because then you might as well learn Russian, right? I mean, if it's
Yeah.
so I guess my
And
question
it's
is,
funny you say
what can you
that.
do
It's
that?
funny you say that. Yeah, it's funny you say that because it ended up being the area that Chinese Pidgin Russian was speaking. They ended up just defaulting to speaking Russian.
Right.
So, as far as the question about learning these languages, I have not seen too much about learning the pidgins in particular.
Yeah.
The Creole, like you mentioned with the Duolingo, I've seen a significant amount of material for Haitian Creole. Unfortunately, these languages would be very difficult to learn. Invariably, outside of Haitian Creole, they have very small populations,
Yeah.
and in some of these cases, like that Chinese Pidgin Russian, it's almost a historical exercise because there are no living speakers. It hasn't been spoken in probably a century or more. And when you look at some of these catalogs or some of these reports from these linguists, it's very technical in nature. Understandably, that's their job. And the materials, while very important for the cataloging of the language, isn't necessarily always the best to learn the language.
Right.
They don't necessarily have dictionaries, things of that nature. So I would say it would be difficult. And obviously, if someone has some information that of other languages outside of Haitian Creole that have that larger, I guess, body of materials to learn from, I'd love to hear it. But yeah, it just seems it would be very difficult, I would imagine.
Yeah. Have you ever seen Tokipona?
I've heard about it from your show actually. I haven't messed around with it. Is that a constructed language or is it a?
Yeah, it is a constructed language, but I was thinking it might be the exercise of learning that might be very similar to the experience of
Mm,
of a pigeon because it's but it's a constructed language completely, yeah, but it's a very minimal language, so you have
see.
120 words or thereabouts, and so everything you make is like a compound. So like a you know like a car, you I think what we ended up on was something like moving building or something, building that runs or something. It's like
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very good exercise. Actually, I've recommended it before, and I'm not a big into like con languages and spending time on learning something that isn't natural because my idea was always well I could just learn something that people actually speak, but I actually think that Tokipona is a very big is a good exercise in what a language really is, and that is what we talked about earlier, translating the thoughts and the ideas from your mind. And if you can
Hmm.
simplify that process, you can actually you'll find that you will be much better at your other languages because you suddenly
Yeah.
understand that okay, I might have this English phrase in my head that I want to say in Spanish, but what am I really trying to say? If it's a really long one or is it unnecessarily complicated, maybe it can be, diluted into the core message, basically, just what
Hmm.
you want to say. So
Yeah,
I'm
and
thinking if that would be a similar experience with Tokipona and a Pidgin because it's such a simple language, but obviously it's a mental challenge to actually say something with just 120 words.
yeah, that's a very fascinating. I guess I didn't know it to that degree. I have seen with natural languages something similar. Have you ever heard of the term basic English?
It rings a bell, but I can't remember anything about it.
Yeah, so basic English and some of these I think there's also one called basic French. It's essentially what you just described, essentially a pared down version of the language. And I don't know how many words. I don't know. I doubt it was 120, 125, but it's a similar concept. But so were you able to pick up on Takipona pretty quickly or?
Oh yeah, it takes about. I mean, but yeah, there's two answers to the question. It takes about a day probably to
Hmm,
learn the vocabulary if you use a spaced repetition system.
okay.
I did it in the Memrise office, and we were there just to do that. So we started in the morning, and we were there all day. So that was why I did it in just one day. And then the next day, it was more about okay, now we know the words. How can we actually say something? And it was a very painstakingly slow and laborious
Hmm.
process because you have to think about everything. And the surprising thing was that it was almost impossible to, I mean, it was hard to speak, but it was almost impossible to listen because the speaker's perception of what things were dictated what words they used. So
Hmm.
while I might say for coffee, I might say a good black liquid or good black water,
Hmm.
someone who doesn't like coffee might say disgusting or evil black water or something. And yellow water
Okay.
could be urine, it could be orange juice.
Orange juice.
So you really discover that with such a limited vocabulary, it becomes an exercise of talking to the same people and then establishing conventions, which I'm sure how every language developed eventually, is that,
Hmm.
people were just saying random things, and then enough people were saying the same random thing that they all decided, this is the word for this now and not this word. That's how I see it happening anyway. There might be
Yeah, I mean
some,
there has to be agreement, right?
yeah, there might
Like
be some
at some point.
linguistics majors jumping and go like, no, what is he
Yeah.
saying? But
Oh,
anyway, that's
no.
how I imagine it with my kind of low tech approach that they must have just there was just lots of words flying around, and then eventually people were like, okay, he says this, let's all call it this. And I guess it's the same with new online things or new tech things, or like in if you translate them, it doesn't sound very good. like computer. You can say in
Uh,
Danish, but you can also there's also Danish words, or like in Norwegian, they have their own Norwegian word for computer. And Esperanto, the Con language, has a continuous battle of new words because some people want them to be compound words, so they actually make sense, like thing that computes, whereas the institute or the people behind it might want to make an entirely new word, or even use like an anglicized version, like
mm,
computero or something. I think that's actually a very interesting discussion. If people are interested in these kind of like Creoles and Pidgins, I imagine people would also be interested in that discussion of Esperanto, which is the most successful con language as far as I know. Like
yeah,
just
and
what's
that
it called?
happens outside of constructed languages too. I mean, look at the Académie Française in France. Obviously, their job, I think, technically, their mission is just to make the dictionary for the French language,
Yeah,
but they do seem to weigh in on certain words and how they should be said or spoken, which doesn't necessarily always align with how the population is using that term. So,
exactly. Yeah, they try to set the rules and grammar rules and stuff, but again, if everyone is using it the other way, then the rules
yeah.
gets changed, which is it's kind of difficult. I remember there were some phrases in Danish where people just didn't know what they were saying, and they just got corrupted so much. You ever heard people say something like a phrase or an idiom, and they just mess it up completely, or they use a different
Mhm.
idiom in the middle? That's what happened in Danish. There was like I don't know if there's an English equivalent, but if you do someone a favor that you think it's a favor, but it turns out not to be, there's a nice Danish phrase for this, and
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
people messed it up so often that eventually it was just accepted. It's like, yeah, now it means both. It's like, what? It's just a complete opposite. It's a complete 180, but that's because it sounds confusing. It's like, the direct translation is like a bear favor. So is that like a big favor, or is it like someone that's gonna maim you favor?
A
Yeah,
savage favor.
exactly. Yeah, pretty much. And so even if the whatever they call the Institute of Danish, they try to set out the rules and grammar rules
Oh,
and
okay.
everything. If the population can't figure it out, or they decide to use it in a different way, then yeah, they'll just send out a directive saying we now accept both here, which is just it's mental, isn't it? That you could just I can imagine I can understand changing it to the opposite, but the fact that it means both is like, well, you're never gonna know, are you? So
I do have a question for you because I don't think I've ever met anybody who spoke Danish from birth, um, or from childhood. Would you say that Danish is healthy, the state of the language, meaning, some of the things we talked about earlier with English and stuff like that,
yeah, I would think so. Yeah, it's a
okay,
very like everyone speaks English and they understand the need for it,
okay,
but it's a very healthy language in the sense that you won't see any Danish people speaking English together unless there's an English speaker in the group.
good,
So
okay,
it's
gotcha.
it's nowhere near a problem, but I can see it as the beginning maybe of something. Maybe it'll be a new language in 200 years time where it's like
Hmm.
half and half. Maybe it'll be a bit like Dutch or something. And that probably takes
I've had
a lot longer, but
Yeah,
you know.
I've been interested in that language, particularly or Scandinavian Nordic languages, and potentially maybe learning it next year. And I find it doesn't seem like Danish has a lot of materials for the English learner. Uh, Swedish does for some
Right.
reason, but English didn't seem to.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, it's good for me because I could create some of those materials maybe
Yeah, definitely.
and maybe get some of that going. I have been thinking about that. But yeah,
There's a need.
I think it's just that Sweden is just so much bigger. It's almost twice the size, I think, and the
Yeah.
land mass is like 5, 10 times. Takes 5 hours to drive from one end of Denmark to the other, but it takes about a day in Sweden. So it's quite a different magnitude. But what's interesting over there, which may interest you, is like the Scandinavian language. When people from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden speak together, and they all sort of meet in the middle in this Scandinavian language. I think that's an interesting thing to look at, because we can sort of understand each other, but you have to make certain adjustments. So if you do speak together, unless you've done it for a long time or you have great experience living in one of the other countries, it becomes a different language in a way. It's like a mix, a Scandinavian, if you will, as a language, and maybe again we will see those merging a bit more later on because they're really similar, like really
Wow.
similar. So
Yeah, they
I,
probably came from a common language. I'm sure that existed, who knows how many years ago, and it's put into those what we call, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark.
yeah,
Um,
Finnish is different. It's completely
oh yeah, it
different,
is.
but
Yeah, it is isolate, right?
it's Iceland, Faroe Islands have are more similar. It's hard to
I
understand them,
gotcha.
but they're similar. And Finnish is it's just a weird cousin that nobody knows. It's like or uncle or something. Like we have no idea what they're saying, and there are no cognates or anything.
Yeah,
Uh,
what you're describing is the same thing in northern India with Hindi, Punjabi, and Urdu. In my opinion, they're very, very similar, and that's what I was saying. I got lucky because if you know one, you
yeah,
got
me
it.
too. Me too. I'm
Yeah,
definitely it's a very privileged position to be in to just get three languages for free.
yeah, pretty much.
Do you have any weird uncles over there that like it's geographically close but just completely different language?
So, I've looked at some languages that are supposedly because Punjabi is what's known as the Indo-Iranian language. And I've looked at some of these other languages like Dari, Pashto, Farsi. There's definitely words that pop out at me when I hear it and things like that, but I don't understand it
Right.
for the most part. So there's definitely I'm sure if I put some effort into it, it'd be easier for me to learn those languages as opposed to something completely new and uncharted territories such as Japanese or something like that.
Right. A good advantage
Yeah.
there. And that I guess that's an advantage that many people have with English. You have French and Dutch and German. All these European languages are kind of similar in a way with the at least with the vocabulary and you can you can get some freebies there if you want to learn a couple of them.
Uh, I mean, I can tell you as a French student for the last 3 years, speaking English has been invaluable.
Yeah.
It has been. I was like, thank God, because when you first go into it, you're like, man, this is gonna be kind of tough. And then there's no doubt they're not the same languages anyway. And some may say that English is an offshoot of French, and obviously it's a Germanic language, but a heavy French influence. And man, there are truly many cognates, and
Yeah.
there's many
I
similarities.
think it's
Yeah,
like 40% cognates I've read somewhere that
there's
is
definitely thousands.
so
Yeah,
you
there's
just
definitely thousands.
know so the trick is if you can't think of the word in French just think of a fancy way of saying it in English and you usually get the French. I don't know
Yeah,
how often that works but it definitely works sometimes.
I'll have to try that next time I get in a bind. See what happens.
Go to Langfest and try to speak a little bit but that's a different French though. I mean not hugely different but that
Um,
is their own little what can you call it like a dialect maybe.
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting historical context too, because a large amount of people settled there. I think around the 18th century, and they spoke French from many different parts of France, which the dialects, I guess, were different for sure. And then they kind of got isolated. They didn't. I don't think they had a lot of contact with the mother country, with France,
Right.
after England
Probably
pretty
not.
much took it over. So in some ways, I have heard that this is from French folks that when they watch French Canadian television in France, they actually use subtitles.
Right.
Um, so I have heard that before. I haven't seen it myself, and I've spoken to French Canadian folks. I haven't had any issues. Their accent is definitely very different than what you'd encounter on the continent in France or in Belgium. But yeah, and I believe that they have also made a conscious effort as far as language of instruction, which is huge for language survival in their schools, to I think start moving more towards that standard French. So
Actually, I think I heard the different story.
really,
Actually,
the opposite. Okay.
yeah, my like we need to fact check my statement there. But I thought I heard because I was there 2 years ago, and I talked to my Airbnb host a bit about this.
Hmm.
Um, And that's also one thing. If you don't speak any French and you're in Montreal, I mean, their English is just extraordinary, so no problems there. But I spoke to him about it, and he said that it was a relatively new concept to have Quebecois textbooks. That the textbooks were like proper from France textbooks up until recently, relatively recently,
Okay.
and then obviously everyone would go out of the classroom, they would speak a completely different way.
Speak what they speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be similar to like Switzerland, where you have like they probably taught the Hochdeutsch, like the main key German, and then they have their
Hmm.
own spoken dialect, the Schweizerdeutsch as they call it. Probably butchered the pronunciation, but the Swiss German, which is really hard to understand. By the way, I don't have much experience with it, but I had a Swiss roommate for a while, and even though I speak German, it's one of my best languages. When he spoke fast, I was like, I have no idea what you're saying. But I can imagine that's what happened. So we need to get back on that for sure, because I think that's what he
Yeah.
told me, that they used to be taught off of the French books, and then it was just pointless
So they moved
because
away from that
yeah,
and
it's not the
moving more
language that they're
towards. Okay,
speaking.
gotcha.
Just to also, I guess, protect the language, like you say, and really underline
Yeah.
the fact that it is actually a standalone language. It's not just some kind of French
Hmm.
corruption. It's their own.
Yeah.
A bit like
It
the
definitely is, and they're very proud of it, and understandably so. And I know that they passed a lot of laws in the last few decades to protect it.
yeah.
And obviously, Canada is a bilingual country, but there's definitely more heavier pockets of French speakers, I think, on the eastern side of the country as opposed to the west.
Oh yeah,
So,
for sure. Yeah, I don't know how it is in the West. I never went that far, but I can imagine they maybe just have it in school like many European countries, and then they have this kind of basic level, maybe some good understanding, but not good
mm,
production necessarily.
yeah,
But that's all guesswork. If anyone is from the western part of Canada,
yeah, I'd love
or
to
indeed
hear
the eastern part, just let us know, because we're in a bit of a deep water here when it comes to this. It's a few years ago since I was there, so I could have
it.
definitely misremembered. But um, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your passion for the topic and these interesting historical. I would almost call them like what oddities, I guess you can call them, because you have ways for natural languages to develop. You have ways for these processes to take place, and they obviously have thousands of years ago. But
Yeah.
then you have these kind of like what happens when two meet, kind of, and what develops, and it's I guess it's a remnant. We probably won't get to see much more of this with all the new technology and
Yeah, I'm sure it doesn't look
globalization,
like it.
but
Yeah.
we can always enjoy what was, and thanks to like the diligent linguist you were talking about, and I hope that people listening who were interested in going into linguistics or maybe are studying for linguistics, you can get some inspiration for some of your language projects. I know there are a lot of, I mean, that's more in the endangered languages, probably documenting and cataloging them,
Yeah.
but you can still get to travel around the world and bring your tapes, your tape recorder, and just document what was for future enjoyment and curiosity. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It was really interesting.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast. I really appreciate having you here today. Just before you leave, I just want to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is italki. Italki is a tutoring platform where you can find affordable tutors for every language in the world, pretty much. So get started today and get a free $10 credit when you book your first lesson. If you go to actualfluency.com/italki, that's spelled Italki. So give it a go and feel how tutoring can really boost and enhance your language learning